Evening. Welcome to the museum at FIT's Fashion Culture Program Series. Tonight, it is our pleasure to welcome Caroline Weber, Professor of French and Comparative Literature at Barnard College, Columbia University. This evening, she will present her most recent book, Proust's Duchess, which takes us into the daily lives of three prominent women in turn of the 19th century Paris. After her talk, we will be taking cards like this with your questions, and after the Q&A with Caroline, she will be signing books on stage. So please join me in welcoming Caroline Weber.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Thank you, Tanya Melendez, and thank you all here at FIT, and all of you for coming out to hear about Proust's Duchess on an evening when I know there are a lot of other distractions, a lot of things that we're all thinking a lot about right now. So thanks for taking the time out to go through this story with me. I want to give you an overview of the project that I've spent the last 7 years working on, and it was the great heartbreak of my life, in fact, that I wasn't able to complete this book in time for the beautiful exhibition on the Comtesse Grefful's fashions here in 2015. But those of you who came and saw that exhibition here, which was superb, will already be a little bit familiar with one of the three leading ladies of the story I'd like to tell you in summary tonight. So my new book is a triple biography of the women who were the real-life models for an iconic character in Marcel Proust's great novel, In Search of Lost Time. That character was called the Duchess de Guermantes, and she was known as the queen of aristocratic society. She basically reigned as the queen of aristocratic society for the better part of the 4,000 pages of Proust's semi-autobiographical novel. The novel came out between 1913 and 1927, but the action that Proust focuses his narrator's attention on in terms of a discovery of the world of high society in Paris really is focused on Paris in the 1880s and 1890s. And that's when these three women, the subjects of my biography, really reigned supreme in this milieu. Their names, as you can see, right to my right to left, or left to right, Genevieves Bizet, Elizabeth Grefful, and Laure de Chevigné. And because they were so easily recognizable as the models for Proust's Duchess de Guermantes when his novel came out, 20 to 30 years after their heyday in society, a strange kind of alchemy happened with their renown. These were women who were incredibly celebrated, incredibly famous for the better part of Proust's young adulthood. By the time he publishes his novel, they are on the decline. There's a new, younger generation of society hostesses who've come up. The world looks a lot different after World War I in Paris especially. And then the novel, being recognized as one of the greatest novels of all time, essentially takes over in becoming what people have really, until I tried to write their story, people have really been content to take as the historical record about these women. These women are now of interest to people, if they are at all, because of the fact that they inspired this character in Proust. But what I wanted to try to understand was, why did Proust fixate on these three women in particular? And how did these three women, none of whom in fact was a duchess, come to enjoy the incredible social ascendancy and cultural authority that they did in the 1880s and 90s, the kind of social ascendancy and cultural authority that Proust would later transfer to his fictional Duchess. So I wanted to look at a little more closely at how it was that these three women managed to rise to the top of an incredibly hierarchical and very small and very exacting social world known variously as the Grata, the Grand Monde, or the Grey World, and the Noble Faubourg. This was a world that in the last several decades of the 19th century was restricted to around roughly about 2,000 people in Paris, with some visiting honorary members, notably from the royal houses all over Europe. And it was a society that was conspicuously devoted to social exclusivity and ostentatious leisure. The main members of this caste belonged to the old hereditary hereditary aristocracy of France, which had been eliminated for the first time after the revolution of 1789 was restored and then done away with, and restored and done away with, and restored and changed around a little bit by Napoleonic emperors at various points in the 19th century. And in the period that I'm talking about, which is the Third Republic of France, which goes from 1870 until World War II, it was actually technically not a legal class anymore at all in France. So these members of the hereditary aristocracy, with the founding of the Third Republic in 1870, lose all of the traditional economic, legal, political prerogatives that had gone with being born into this aristocratic caste. They were allowed only the kind of courtesy of being able to continue to use their titles if they had them, and they did continue to use their titles. And the paradox of this period is that these conspicuously leisure-prone, beautifully dressed, constantly seemingly frolicking and enjoying themselves at balls and costume parties and diplomatic receptions in Paris, to the envy of a large public that's excluded, all they really have going for them is the kind of residual allure that comes from belonging to a class that is no longer anything more than a myth. And yet, paradoxically, in these final decades of the 19th century, this dead, politically and economically dead aristocracy rises from its own ashes and becomes an incredible, captivating myth. Traditionally, the hereditary aristocracy didn't work except in the church, in the military, and in diplomacy. And that ethos of not working did mean that people had a lot of time on their hands to give very good parties, to dress very well. This is a painting of Jean Béraud is one of the best chroniclers of this milieu in this time period, and he paints a lot of very beautiful party scenes. And I wanted to show it to you just to give you an idea of from the elegance of evening attire in this set. So evening dress for the men, dresses with trains, intensely corseted and bustled, long gloves for the women and the men, top hats that are placed on the floor as soon as they walk into a party. And these kinds of parties which happen in the evening, a soirée, by definition an evening party, would have been the capstone on a day in which the average woman in the monde, in this society, would have already undergone about 6 or 7 outfit changes. So this was a class that loved clothes, loved luxurious display, and women were the real peacocks of this caste, and they were also the social gatekeepers of this class. They kept the guest lists, they threw the parties, they decided who was in and who was out. This world, in its exclusivity, yet so conspicuously devoted to these incredible diversions and social entertainments in the middle of Paris, became enticing to a broad French public that never had any hope of being invited to any of these parties. One of the princesses whose memoirs I read in my research uses a great analogy. She says that in this period, during the fin-de-siècle, the gratin, the social world, was as distant from the average man on the street in Paris as the moon was from the earth. It was this incredible, exotic world that was tantalizingly within reach, in the sense that you could see these people going by in their carriages. Sometimes if you were really curious, you might bribe the servants or the florists or the bakers to find out what was really happening inside. I discovered in my research that Proust actually did resort to that method in order to find out more about these fascinating and impenetrable, socially unattainable goddesses and gods, especially goddesses. But the mystery surrounding these people and the glamour surrounding their high-stepping social lives essentially spawned an entire tabloid industry that is an avatar of what we know as the celebrity tabloids today. It was a subset of the French newspaper industry called the presse mondaine, the press devoted to the frolics of the monde, and it meant that the seemingly smallest, least significant kind of activity, like somebody wearing a new hat to the horse races, somebody having a few friends over for a tea party, all of this was front page news in the presse mondaine, and it paradoxically put this seemingly unattainable class that was closed to everybody but people who were born and married into it within the reach of a public that in fact never had any hope of banging down its carefully guarded doors. So these are just some samples of some of the front pages and some of the illustrations from some of these newspapers. And it was through that kind of popularization in the press that young people like Proust, who was a generation younger than the three women he would become so transfixed by, that's how people began to get a sense of some familiarity with this world that was officially, ostensibly closed to outsiders of lower birth. I don't know if any of you are readers of the celebrity tabloids to this day, but I often regret when I've got a lot of work to do, or spending 7 years writing a book, that so much of my brain seems to be taken up with information about celebrities that I don't care anything about, and yet somehow I know the strange names of all their children and their fashion choices and what they wore to the Emmys, and I would love to clear that space for something else, but the constant barrage, the media barrage that we live under, it makes it hard to avoid. And I would say that Proust was no unwitting victim of the presse mondaine. He avidly consumed these stories, but there was a kind of cultural saturation because of the press, because of the strange waltz between a politically powerless, economically now no longer specially advantaged aristocratic class, and a media that made its money off of telling stories about this fabulous and unattainable life they led. The paradox of all of this is that at the very moment when France is once again, and for the third time in less than 100 years, embarking politically and socially on an official program of liberty, equality, and fraternity, the aristocracy has more prestige than it has ever had before. So if you were, for instance, the Comtesse Greffule, a French friend of mine loves to tell a story that his grandmother told him, that late in life she was on vacation at this hotel in Lausanne, Switzerland, and this was in maybe the 1940s. The Comtesse Greffule lived until 1952, and my friend's grandmother was in the dining room of this hotel, and all of a sudden there's a huge hullabaloo coming from all over this big, very very beautiful dining room. It's where my parents used to stay when I was in school there, and waiters are running around, and people are running in, and the manager is in, and people at tables are bustling and dropping their glasses, and nobody can believe it, and it's this incredible excitement. And my friend's grandmother asked a waiter, well, what's going on? And the waiter said, oh, it's Madame Greffule, she's traveling incognito. And so 100 people who are eating their breakfast are suddenly all aware that she's incognito, and the Comtesse Greffule sweeps into the dining room with kind of a little bit too late people behind her imposing screens between her and this fascinated and curious public. She was 80-something years old when this was going on, and this was a technique that she had perfected long before then. But so the kind of frenzy of adulation and curiosity and fascination that these women inspired was really remarkable, and really came as a surprise to me when I set out to do some research into the culture that produced the real-life material for the Duchess de Guermantes. And the great paradox, again, is that this culture, ostensibly now devoted to liberty, equality, and fraternity, reveres the nobility like never before. And one of the great, very acerbic social commentators from the time was this man, Jules Renard, who was a prominent journalist and man of letters. He belonged to the prestigious Académie Française, whose 40 members are held to be the 40 greatest embodiments of French letters alive, known as the Immortals. Jules Renard, and from his perch as an immortal, complained that since the Revolution of 1789, there had been no progress made in France toward actual egalitarianism, actual meritocracy, actually working for a living, and self-improvement and education. All anybody cares about in our republic is getting invited to the Comtesse Greffule. So, and I can tell you that does seem, based on my 7 years of research, that doesn't seem to be at all an exaggeration. So one of the people who falls under the spell of this paradoxically mythical and alluring aristocracy during a period of ostensible democracy is the young Marcel Proust. Proust is born in 1871, so a year after the Third Republic is established, and he himself is kind of a poster child for all of what we in particular in America, I think, would regard as admirable about the Third Republic. His mother was a Jewish heiress who had important family members both in the intellectual world, in the political world, in industry, in banking. His father was a self-made man from the petite bourgeoisie in the provinces. His father's father had been a grocer in a small provincial town. His father, by dint of just hard work and individual, really apparently incredible brilliance as a doctor, rose through the ranks of the medical profession, became one of the leading, most esteemed medical faculty members in Paris, and his specialty was epidemiology. He was one of the first and considered the greatest specialist on epidemic diseases, malaria and cholera, of which there were many, many outbreaks in Europe at this time. And so Proust's father became this important public health official. His parents represented, in a way, all that was great about a period that would be referred to after the fact as the Belle Époque, all the advances in the arts, in politics, in culture, in technology, in business, in banking. All of that would largely be generated and produced by the bourgeoisie, but it was still a period when the bourgeoisie that was accomplishing all this felt kind of bad that it wasn't invited to the aristocracy's parties. And poor Marcel Proust, even coming from this, in fact, incredibly impressive family, always felt from a very young age, and has left a fair bit of documentation to this effect in his private writings, as well as via his fictional alter ego Marcel in his novel. He bemoans from really his teenage years on the fact that for all of the impressiveness of his parents, he's never going to find a way into the noble faubourg. He admired his mother immensely, and for good reason. His mother was, by all accounts, an incredibly charming, well-educated, refined woman who homeschooled Marcel when Marcel's many ailments, in particular asthma, kept him home from classes, and she taught Marcel to all of the great French literary works by heart. So those of you who know Proust and love Proust know that Proust peppers literary quotations from great French classics throughout his novel, often in humorous contexts, and this was a game he used to play with his mother. And so Proust adored his mother, she adored him, but he said in this one very sad letter that he wrote in, I want to say 1891, when he was 20 years old, the noble faubourg is so fascinating to me, and even my mother can't get me invited there. Even maman can't get invited there. So what did it take? How did one even think about trying to penetrate this world, trying to launch oneself up to this world that was to the ordinary bourgeois in Paris as the moon was to the earth? Well, Proust had kind of a big break, in a sense, in high school. He attended an elite boys' private school called the Lycée Condorcet on the right bank, where a number of sons of not so much aristocratic families, but other prominent haut bourgeois families attended, and two of his schoolmates who were a grade behind him in high school and with whom he became fascinated in the equivalent of 11th grade and their equivalent of 10th grade, happened to be the son and the nephew of one of the few women in Paris at that time who had been essentially adopted into the aristocracy on an honorary basis, even though she was from the haute bourgeoisie and was Jewish. Proust was half Jewish. His father was Catholic. This woman was entirely Jewish, and she became the first subject of Proust's fascination in this world of the gratin. She represented a path that maybe he could follow by finding a way into this incredibly closed society where traditionally neither bourgeois nor Jews were welcome. The two boys were called Jacques Bizet, the son of the woman in question, and Daniel Halévy, her nephew, or really actually her dear friend and first cousin's son, known as her nephew in the Breton way to the French. And Proust, these were also the first two documented objects of Proust's homosexual affection. There's a chapter in my book where I had a lot of fun reading the lovesick poetry that he wrote for these two boys in high school, and it was kind of a classic case of he was the slightly nerdy older boy who never really fit in very well. These two boys were young and handsome and had these socially prominent parents who I'll talk more about in just a moment, and were athletic and were hearty and hale, and Proust was sickly and kind of short, and they were tall and strapping, and they shaved and he didn't yet, and everything was working against him, and he somehow nevertheless believed that if he tried to touch them with his literary prowess, that maybe they would give him the time of day. And it didn't, his love poetry didn't have the effect of convincing them to enter into a romantic relationship with him. Neither of them was interested in that with him or in general. They both were apparently heterosexual men and went on to have marriages with women, but they were kind of impressed by Proust's literary talent, and these were young men who both fancied themselves the future of Parisian arts and letters because of the prominent family they came from, and so they had this little clique that they called the Little Literary Gang. They included Proust somewhat begrudgingly in the clique, recognizing that he was brilliant, although finding him largely annoying, as they both said many times at the time, and even after Proust's ascent to the pantheon of literary genius. They were annoyed by him, they included him in the group, and this became Proust's in with Jacques Bizet's mother, who is the exceptional Jewish woman accepted into the aristocracy on a provisional basis as kind of a token member of the bourgeoisie. Why and how did Geneviève Halévy Bizet-Strauss get this special dispensation from an aristocracy that was not only incredibly inward-looking, but quite frankly and unapologetically anti-Semitic? It had a lot to do with the fact that she had a cachet that even the grandest members of the aristocracy couldn't claim for themselves. Members of the aristocracy were intensely conscious of who had royal lineage, who were, was related to various important dukes or marquises in England or Germany or Italy, who had been very close to what Pope in the Renaissance. This was the kind of bread and butter of aristocratic prestige, but Paris, then in particular in the 19th century, was the capital of the world for the arts, for music, for painting, for literature, and this was a world that Geneviève happened to be born into at a very high level. Her father is somebody that we don't really remember much at all today, but he was one of the great icons of French music throughout the 19th century, Marcel Halévy, a great French composer who, until Geneviève's first husband came along, and Geneviève's first husband was Fromental's student at the Paris Conservatoire, was regarded as the greatest opera composer that France produced throughout that century. Fromental's greatest hit, La Juive, or The Jewess, was the most performed opera all over the world in the 19th century. And it's an opera that, again, those of you who are familiar with Proust know that Proust quotes arias from it in a tongue-in-cheek way, especially when he's having his anti-Semitic characters try to notify somebody else in a social setting that someone who's walked in is Jewish. They'll hum an aria from La Juive. So Proust turned it into a little bit of an in-joke with Geneviève, but the reason I mention Fromental now is that the aura around him and his family was huge. This man was a legend. When he died in, I want to say he died in the early 1870s, 1860s, 1870s, when Geneviève was a very young woman, and all of the theaters and concert halls went dark in Paris to honor him. He was given a state funeral. Thousands of people poured into the streets to follow his funeral cortege. This man was a rock star, and Geneviève, having grown up as one of his two children, and in fact her older sister died very young in mysterious circumstances, Geneviève, after Fromental's death, was the living repository of her father's legacy and her father's celebrity. And that celebrity only intensified when her husband, whom she married for love, Georges Bizet, when she was 20 years old, died 6 years later, a few months after, kind of again in mysterious circumstances, and after the discouraging critical failure of what he had regarded rightly as his greatest work to date, the opera Carmen. And he had the opera was based on a novella by Prosper Mérimée, but Prosper Mérimée in the novella talks about this sort of gypsy character of Carmen as evoking something of the Sephardic Jewess. And Bizet, who also, like Proust's father, was from the petite bourgeoisie in the provinces, conflated the gypsy and his exotic, half Sephardic Jewish wife with this incredible kind of exotic allure, also with a sort of independence bred of her bohemian upbringing. In Genevieve's case, she grew up around all of these artists. And when Bizet died and his opera was a flop, Geneviève was heartbroken, but she realized very quickly that tides would turn in her favor once Carmen was rediscovered shortly after his death and posthumously recognized as the greatest work of French opera since La Juive. So Bizet is dead, her father is dead, Geneviève, the woman who was closest to and inspired in particular the work of Carmen, but was also the beloved daughter of the creator of La Juive, it becomes the icon and the stand-in for both of these men. She becomes a subject of incredible public fascination. When Bizet died, she was actually a disgruntled housewife. She was carrying on an affair secretly with Bizet's best friend, who is a kind of second-tier concert pianist. And she got engaged to this man secretly very shortly after Bizet died. And once Bizet became a posthumous celebrity, she dumped the second-tier pianist and she prolonged her public performance as the widow Bizet. She wore, at the time it was conventional, it was expected to wear full mourning dress of all black for a year to mourn the death of a spouse. Geneviève wore full mourning for Georges Bizet for 6 years. She posed for this famous painting, and I'm sorry, my pointer, it doesn't seem to be, I can't get a dot to go up there, but you can see the painting to my far left in which Geneviève is wearing widow's weeds, painted by Élie Delaunay. This work, she not only encouraged Delaunay to paint her in widow's weeds many years after Bizet had died. She had already moved on with a number of other flirtations that were all kind of covert with other men, but in public she was the widow Bizet. She encouraged Delaunay to exhibit it publicly at the Salon de Paris, the annual big show of academic painting in Paris, and this painting became a kind of substitute for Geneviève. She loaned it to exhibitions all the time. Guy de Maupassant, a novelist who started to frequent her salon, turned it into a major character in one of his last novels, which he wrote while he was having a covert affair with Geneviève. All of this celebrity attached to Geneviève because she was this surviving muse of these two dear departed French geniuses. And this is what the aristocracy was attracted to in Geneviève Bizet. It was an incredible rush to be around a woman who was that close to these masters of French culture. The aristocracy may not have been inclined to work for a living, but even those aristocrats with kind of an indolent attitude toward life tended, because of the French cultural bias in favor of the arts and letters and music, tended to appreciate this kind of thing, tended to appreciate and revere artistic greatness. And so Geneviève was invited to all of these society parties where few Jewish bourgeois had ever set foot before, largely on the strength of her late husband's and her late father's celebrity, and also on the strength of the incredible mix of artists that she invited to her own salon. Growing up as the daughter of Fromental Halévy, she had known all of these famous artists and musicians since birth. Gounod was her piano teacher and self-described second father. Gustave Moreau, Edgar Degas came to her parents' salon every day, and then after her father died, he came to Geneviève's salon every day. And so Geneviève, in entertaining these artists, also offered something appealing to the aristocracy that they couldn't find in their own exclusive salon. Even the most artistically inclined of the aristocracy might occasionally have one well-known musician come and perform, or one well-known poet come and read some work to entertain the rest of the aristocratic guests. But Geneviève's was the only place in Paris where one could actually fraternize with these exotic specimens who were the bohemian artists of that era. And so her salon became known as this really unusual hybrid blend of artistic genius and aristocratic panache. And I've circled a few of the society figures and the artists who appear in some of these snaps from a Genevieve family album. Many of these pictures were actually in this album, which is up at the Metropolitan Museum here in New York, were actually taken by Edgar Degas, one of the close family friends. She remarries 11 years after Georges Bizet's death. She remarries this man called Emile Strauss, shown in blue. His big claim to fame was that he was widely believed to be, and I think rightly believed to be, the illegitimate son of Baron James de Rothschild, then the richest man in the world. Genevieve didn't love Emile Strauss by any account, and she was famous in addition to her artistic friends. She was appreciated in the aristocracy for her droll and ironic wit, and when she notified her friends in both the aristocracy and the art world that she was marrying this man, they all found incredibly tedious. Strauss was kind of a temperamental, bullying man. He was a lawyer who had, quote unquote, according to one other person in the salon, a lawyer's habit of talking too much. He was hated by all of her friends. Genevieve didn't really appear to like him that much either, and when her friends asked her why on earth she had agreed to accept his proposal, she said, well, marrying him is the only way to get rid of him. So, and that kind of esprit was the esprit that Proust would go on to ascribe to the Duchess de Guermantes. And he would often refer to it, Proustians in the room know that he would often refer to it as the esprit à la vie, a reference to Genevieve's maiden name, and a strange reference otherwise. Typically one wouldn't imagine that a duchess from an ultra-Catholic, conservative, blue-blooded, ancient French family would be associated with the sort of contemporary Jewish humor of the boulevards and La Juive. So Genevieve's dear friend, first cousin, brother she never had, Ludovic Halévy himself, another member with Jules Renard, the acerbic diarist of the Académie Française, this pantheon to Gallic literary genius. He was the first Jew accepted into the Académie Française, in fact, and he famously described his cousin's salon as a place where Saint-Germain, the members of the noble faubourg, came to see artistic bohemia, represented by the Chat Noir, an infamous cabaret in Montmartre, a bohemian artistic quarter then and still somewhat now, and the Chat Noir came to see the faubourg. Both sides were fascinated by this opportunity to mingle with the other half in Genevieves Salon, and this gave her a kind of pedigree in society that nobody else equaled at the time. And Marcel Proust, from what we would call his senior year in high school on, becomes a loyal, devoted, regular caller in her Sunday salon. He kind of sneaks in on the tailcoat of his friend Jacques Bizet, her son, her only child, and Jacques Bizet was not that interested in meeting his mother's famous friends, either from the art world or the aristocracy, but Proust was, and to use a French verb, he encrusted himself at the edge of her, on the kind of outer perimeters of her salon, where people largely disregarded him, except to observe sometimes how strange he looked, staring at them all with these huge, wide, worshipful eyes. People being kind referred to him as her delicious little page, her little carabino. So this was Proust's way into the aristocracy, and he and through Genevieve he managed to meet, or at least to get to view up close and personally, if even he wasn't considered important enough for them to deign to speak to him, other leading members of the aristocracy. One of those is Laure de Chevigny, who was another. She's really very much the physical model for the Duchess de Guermantes. Hooded blue eyes, a slightly beakish nose, skin that was prone to rosacea, very thin and fragile skin, and reddish blonde hair. Laure de Chevigny was actually in herself a kind of an incarnation of this meeting of the Chat Noir and the Faubourg, in the sense that she, as an aristocrat by birth and also by marriage, she was included in all of the stodgy, conservative, exclusive aristocratic parties that the noble Faubourg enjoyed all of the time as a matter of course. But one of her claims to fame within the aristocracy is that she loved to misbehave. And so she would take a group of people from a boring party like this, again depicted by Jean Béraud, and which would tend to end early. She was a night owl. She would take them out to these sort of rough quarters of Paris where they could mingle with, the French have a great expression, nostalgie de la boue, where they could satisfy their nostalgia for mud, for dirtiness, for these sort of dangerous characters, these artists and cut purses. And the favorite spot of Laure's, and a spot that she did much to popularize with the aristocracy, was this place, the Chat Noir. One of the great distinguishing features of the Chat Noir at this time, this cabaret cabaret in Bohemian Montmartre was the proprietor Rodolphe Salis would, if he spied anybody coming in who appeared to be from the upper echelons of French society, he would go charging over to the door and he would greet them with torrents of X-rated abuse, just very theatrically and yelling and cursing for all he was worth. Everybody else in the place would crack up and sort of, throw glasses and throw food, and it was a very wild and rowdy scene. It was quite the opposite of what was happening at these parties in the noble faubourg, and Laure loved it, and Laure's companions, the ones who were daring enough to join her on these outings, loved it as well, just for the salacious difference, the contrast that it provided to the predictability and the intensely ceremonial and etiquette-bound nature of their other entertainments. Laure came by her nostalgie labou and her tendency to rebellion. Honestly, she was the great-granddaughter of the Marquis de Sade, who has still not been surpassed in his reputation for the most obscene and shocking, pornographically minded French writer effectively in history. Also the one who has the record for the French writer who was imprisoned under the most sequential political regimes. He was thrown for various crimes against humanity and morals, poisoning prostitutes, kidnapping homeless women and torturing them, having orgies. If you name it, he wrote about it and he did it, and he was imprisoned under Louis XV, under Louis XVI, during the Revolution, during the Reign of Terror, during the Directoire, and under Napoleon I. So this was a man with a bad reputation. And Laure, as his great-granddaughter and bearing the Sade name as her family name, really had two choices. And it's a choice that members of this family still have to make. It's a name that's still around and a family that's still around, which is either you can try to downplay it and maybe mumble it when people are asking what your name is, or you can openly love it. And Laure decided she was going to openly love it. She was going to make this a feature of her prestige, of her singular rebellious allure. Memoirs, chroniclers of the time and people who were friends with Laure say it was really shocking the degree to which she loved to talk about her ancestors' X-rated exploits. She read all of his work because she liked to curse, which was really looked down upon in aristocratic society. When she died in 1936, she was still remembered for the shockwaves she had sent through Parisian society 50 years earlier, when she was the first woman ever heard to say the word merde. That's basically not even a curse word in the Marquis de Sade's novels. They're so graphic and explicit. But Laure decided that she was going to make the shocking aspect of her lineage part of her persona, and it worked again. It was kind of, again, like Genevieve's connection to the art world. It provided spice. It was something different in a milieu that was so custom-bound and tradition-bound and so restricted by things like birth and marriage and family ties. So Laure loved to bring up the Marquis de Sade at every chance, and that was something that scandalized and amused her peers in equal measure, and also made her a fascinating figure to the writers for the Presse Mondaine. She was also famous for importing this rebellious sensibility to probably the stodgiest place in Europe at this time, which was the Exiled Court of the last French Bourbon pretender to the throne. When Laure was 19 years old, she was married off in an arranged marriage that didn't have really much love on either side ever, to a man whose only claim to fame and whose only apparent advantage, he wasn't rich, he didn't cut a kind of a brilliant figure in French society, he came from a respectable old family, but the only thing that he kind of had going for him and that appealed to Laure was that he had this job as a courtier at this exiled court in Austria. So the Bourbon branch of the French royal family had been exiled from France in 1830. This man had lived in exile ever since. By the time Laure gets there as a 19-year-old bride of his courtier, who was one of his personal secretaries, and one of whose tasks included helping him tie his shoes, which he never learned how to do himself. When Laure gets there, this is a very dismal place. The Comte de Chambord, as this man is known, or to his followers, he's regarded as the legitimate king Henry V. He's a depressed man. He had led a lackluster, half-hearted coup d'etat a few years before Laure got got there that had just failed miserably. He took this white horse named Popular Demand back to France and was expecting the French people to welcome him by popular demand. Nobody had been popularly demanding his return, and so according to Laura's husband, who was with him on this trip, he cried all the way back to Austria. It was a very depressing place, but it was a place that prided itself on being a miniature Versailles, if not in grandeur. Today it's an office building for the Austrian post office. It was in etiquette. There was incredibly strict royal etiquette that held sway there. You know, you bowed to the king's chair even if he wasn't sitting in it. You bowed to the king's roast beef if you saw it walking by, riding by on a tray. Sorry, not walking. Riding by on a tray on the way to dinner. You walked out of the room backwards. There was this elaborate court etiquette that Laure learned to perfection, and that then stood her in very good stead when the good old Comte de Chambord dies in 1883. She and her husband are liberated from this kind of depressing place. They go back to Paris, and she has two advantages. One, she can make up anything she wants about her adventures at court. So she tells this great story about how the last Bourbon French king was in love with her, and she hinted that maybe her children were really his children, which they definitely were not. But also she had learned, and she knew that that would carry her far in a society where royal mistresses had always had a especially prestigious place in the social hierarchy. But she also knew royal etiquette, and she understood what it meant to be around royalty all the time. And so even though France in this period is a republic, it's the only one other than Switzerland to be a republic in Europe in that period. And because Paris is such a wonderful and exciting place to be, royals from all over Europe visited constantly, and Laure effectively appointed herself the royal tour guide, the royal handmaiden, the royal babysitter. No matter where you were visiting from, Laure would be sure to meet your train. Laure would take you out to these parties. Laure would then take you out to the Chat Noir. She loved her closest friends in this whole royal set she moved in, and I think I have a slide that says, she liked to say that she was poor in income but rich in highnesses. She collected them very proudly, and her closest friends were the Grand Duke and Grand Duchess Vladimir of Russia. And the Grand Duchess Vladimir was famously dowdy, but famously also generous with her phenomenal jewel collection. And so Laure loved to shock the Vladimirs by taking them to these sort of dodgy, risque joints in dangerous or bohemian parts of town. But then she liked to go back to the noble faubourg wearing some jewels that the Grand Duchess had given her as a gift, and kind of complain about how they were really too showy. Oh, I'm sorry, these rubies, I know they're really huge, but I have to wear them because she gave them to me. And this is something Proust actually transposes that entire thing onto the, I forget whether it's in the Côté de Guermantes or Sodome et Gomorrhe, but either volume 3 or volume 4 of Proust's novel, there's a little kind of throwaway line where the Duchess de Guermantes is at a ball and she's complaining about how her rubies are really so tacky, but she has to wear them because they're a gift from her great royal best friend. So she has this incredible allure because she's a rebel, but also a royal best friend, a royal handmaiden, and that endears her to the presse mondaine, and it makes her a major character in these newspapers of the time. Proust was reading about her for years before he first laid eyes on her in Genevieves Salon's Salon. The third and last woman of this trifecta is the one who was the most difficult for Proust to get access to, in large part because she never darkened the door of Geneviève Strauss's salon. She was somebody who didn't tend to make friendships with other women. She liked being the only woman and the most beautiful woman in the room. One of the characteristics that Proust borrows from her persona for the Duchess de Guermantes is when he writes of the Duchess de Guermantes as the most beautiful, the richest, and the most cheated on woman in the French aristocracy. And that was Elizabeth to a T. Elizabeth, born de Caraman-Chimay, in a very prominent Franco-Belgian aristocratic and princely family, is married off when she's 18 to one of the richest men in the French aristocracy and one of the most philandering, named Henry Vicomte and later Comte Greffule. I think Valerie Steele talks a little bit in her exhibition essay about the Comtesse Greffule and the wonderful catalog from that show here 3 years ago. ago, Elizabeth kept a honeymoon diary where she's just pulled off this incredible coup. Her family don't have a lot of money, and so they're very excited to marry her off to this titled man with a gigantic real estate and industrial and banking fortune. And Elizabeth, in her teens, still naively thinks that somehow this is her fairy tale. And there's kind of an arrested development that happens with Elizabeth. She's 18 when she gets married, and all the way up into her 90s when she dies, she's writing in her diary and in her personal essays and her unpublished literary efforts all these variations on the fairy tale that she was supposed to get by marrying Henry Griffude that never panned out. In her marriage diary, or her honeymoon diary as she calls it, she and her husband spent their honeymoon doing at one of the Griffude's many phenomenal palatial estates not too far from Paris in the Seine-et-Marne. This one was called Bois Boudron. They were married in September, and so they spent the whole fall and winter hunting and shooting there with an extended, very aristocratic and exclusive group of family members and friends. And Elizabeth, you can actually see the teardrops on the page in her diary when she first figures out that one of the reasons her husband has been disappearing mysteriously in the middle of the day at various points throughout their honeymoon is because he's got a mistress who's the wife of one of his friends in the next chateau over. And Elizabeth really seems at this moment to have decided that if her prince, her husband, wasn't going to be in love with her, she was going to make sure that every other man who met her was. And she really succeeded in this goal. She was somebody who loved ostentatious fashions, as those of you who saw the exhibition here know well. Because she had limitless wealth from Henry, she had a gigantic clothing allowance of 300,000 francs. And I think in my book I try to do the equivalence of like how many hundreds of thousands of loaves of bread that could have bought or whatever. It's always hard to translate currency in today's terms, but it was a queenly sum that she was allowed to spend on clothing. And so she had all of these couture dresses made really to attract maximum attention to herself. Henry, even though he cheated not only with this mistress who was one castle over during their honeymoon, but in fact he had 300 documented mistresses in Paris when he died in the 1930s, who all came forward with identical love contracts that he had made them sign, swearing to love them until they died. They all then came forward saying, well, since he died, could we get some of that money? And that's how Elizabeth found out there were at least 300 of them. And so while Henry is doing that, he doesn't like the idea of his wife going out a lot. Maybe because he himself is so sexually loose in his morals, he was very tyrannical with her, imposed a strict curfew on her. But what that meant for her fashion was that she designed clothes. These were the first versions of kind of red carpet clothing. Someone's only going to see you in it for 2 seconds, but then everyone's going to talk about it for like all time. And so Elizabeth would do these things in Paris. Worth was one of her favorite couturiers, but in fact her designs were so specific to her, she reworked these designs so much to kind of suit her own myth of herself as Paris's uncrowned queen. In a period when there is no actual royal family in France anymore, she anointed and appointed herself as France's fashion queen and as the aristocracy's reigning beauty queen. So she loved, one of her personae was the chaste hunt goddess Diana, and that's her on my right with in one of her Diana ensembles. Here she is in a famous Worth dress, her lily dress from the 1890s. And one thing that people don't usually talk about when they write about this dress is the fact that Elizabeth has these kind of embroidered and appliqued versions of the emblem of the French royal family, the fleur de lis. So all of these things, she's anointing herself as a queen. She's appearing at all the costume parties she goes to. She always has different disguises: Queen of the Night, Queen of Hearts, Queen Elizabeth I. And just to impress upon the public that, thank you so much, that to impress upon the public that she is their queen, and people believe it. Because Henry has this strict curfew, she does these intensely choreographed, very short appearances where she will appear in kind of a whirl of feathers and tulle in the middle of a concert or a lecture or a party, and then she'll disappear again and leave everybody talking about her. People like to call this, one of her contemporaries referred to these, she would always arrive about an hour after everybody else to make sure everyone looked at her when she barged in late and disruptively, and these were referred to as her picturesque latenesses. And this was a technique that really worked to help captivate the public imagination. She was somebody who wrote endlessly at home. During these many costume changes, she would stand at her bureau or her vanity writing notes to herself, writing treatises, theories of her beauty, theories of her prestige, things that Proust would have actually loved to have read, because a lot of his idea about what prestige was is echoed by the Comtesse Greffule in her private writings that were never published, that prestige means always keeping a little distance between you and your public, always leaving them wanting more. This was something that she perfected. It made her effectively the reigning queen, not only of the aristocracy, but of the presse mondaine throughout the late 19th century and well up until World War I. And the two men who she especially liked to leak details of her incredibly glamorous but exclusive and unattainable life to Arthur Meyer and Gaston Calmette were credited with one of their contemporaries with having invented this American idea of celebrity. Elizabeth, with these other two women, was really in this trifecta of incredible grit and determination and self-will and narcissism and glamour, who imposed themselves on the public imagination. And although we know a little bit that we live with this kind of cult of celebrity and cult of the beautiful Instagram image and cult of the beautiful designer dress to this day, for Proust it was something that had a deeply stirring creative effect. And so I wanted to close just with this lovely passage where he describes his alter ego Marcel waiting outside the door of the Duchess de Guermantes' house, where he's going to follow her around on her morning round of errands, as he does every day for several weeks, until she yells at him. This is a real life thing that Proust actually did to Madame de Chavigny. Followed her around every day for a few weeks when he was 21 until she yelled at him. And the passage is a lovely one. Never was a fanatical admirer of a famous actress whom he does not know, posting himself outside the stage door and patrolling there in the hope of seeing her, as overcome with emotion as I was when I laid eyes on the Duchesse de Guermantes. And just as a fairy comes to life when our imagination invests her with magic, so did Madame de Guermantes' aura exist inside me, transporting me into the poetic domain. Thank you. I've got your questions. I only have 3, so if anybody has any more, let me know, but let me get to these first then. Do you think that Proust was inspired by the Demimonde? Would it be related to the great-granddaughter of the Marquis de Sade? That's a great, who asked that question, if I may, unless you want to stay anonymous for some reason, but I can't see you, but it's a great question. No, Proust was inspired by the demi-monde. The demi-monde, this kind of world of high-class courtesans who were these professional beauties, as they were called, who were often kept by members of the aristocracy and the haute bourgeoisie, including Elizabeth Greffu's husband, Henry, had many relationships with many high-profile demi-mondaines. So there was kind of a permeability in a certain shadowy area of the aristocracy between the demi-monde and the real aristocratic monde, but that tended to be the world of heterosexual men and their love affairs. And so that for Proust, as a young gay man, the demi-monde didn't interest him in the way that it pruriently interested the men who either wanted to keep these women or wanted at least to fantasize about what it would be like to be with these women. But Proust was interested in the kind of strange sexual prestige and social prestige that demographic enjoyed, these high-class courtesans. And the great-granddaughter of the Marquis de Sade was not for him the main one of this trio who really gave him some characteristics that he would ascribe to the one quasi-courtesan in his novel, Odette de Crécy, who becomes Odette Swann. He actually borrowed some of the characteristics of Geneviève Strauss for Odette. In particular, Geneviève Strauss, one of the things I didn't mention, speaking of fashion, is that after her 5 or 6 years in all black as the widow Bizet, she decided that she was going to shift to a palette of half mourning, which again you would traditionally just wear for a few months as a transition from full black back to ordinary colors. But instead, Geneviève transitioned to this palette of half mourning and then stayed there for the rest of her life, including throughout her very long marriage to the unloved Emile Strauss, who she was then married to for like 40-some years. And that palette was gray, like dove gray, mauve, and white, pink and white. And Odette, the great kind of cocotte or professional beauty in Proust's novel, wears Geneviève's clothes. Geneviève, and not only entertained in these colors to remind remind everyone all the time that she was still the widow Bizet, but she also wore these colors in kind of risque fabrics and styles. She was somebody who, unlike the very prim and buttoned-up women of the monde, showcased her bohemian side by entertaining in house dresses, in little filmy peignoirs with a negligee and a little piece of fur, you know, slung over her neck, and oh, I am so cold, but then she would slip the robe open so you would see her ankle, which at that time was like being topless or something. It was such a thrill to these men to see a glimpse of stocking, as it were. And so Proust really does ascribe some of those sartorial theatrics and tricks to Odette de Crécy, but Proust also did become acquainted with one woman in particular whose name I'm now blanking on, who was a very, very prominent courtesan in late 19th century France, who he also borrowed some characteristics from for the character of Odette in his novel. But the great-granddaughter of the Marquis de Sade, for all of her rebellious antics, she was far too much of a grande dame to allow herself to be put in the category of these beauties for hire. So that's where the line is different. And I see a hand there, but I'm just going to answer these two, if I may, on the written card first. How did this? I love this question because it's such an interesting one. How did Proust regard and practice or not his Judaism, and how did it affect his life? That's a longer story, but my book ends. Proust was born in 1871. Originally, my book, I wanted to tell the story up until his death in 1922 of how these women rose to social prominence, how he became obsessed with them, and then how he wrote about them and put them in a book that outlived him and outlived them. And instead, my book, because I got so much material from the families and the research became so interesting and their lives were so much more complex and full of secrets than I had anticipated when I started the project, my book ends in 1894 and it opens in 1885. It's 9 years, 700 pages long, and I think it's a great, juicy story, but I mention this in the context of Proust Judaism because the first phase when Proust's Judaism really becomes an issue for him socially and culturally is starting in 1897 when the Dreyfus affair explodes in the French national consciousness. So this Jewish French army officer who was falsely accused of treason, of selling military secrets to the Prussians, who are France's sworn enemies since the Franco-Prussian War 20-some years before, it became clear very early on in the Dreyfus affair that Dreyfus was not guilty of these crimes, that the document that was used to incriminate him was forged. And this was a moment when all of a sudden being Jewish or not really became a thing that was first and foremost in Proust's mind, as well as in that of many assimilated haut bourgeois Jews. Proust did not think of himself, in fact, as Jewish really until the Dreyfus affair. He was baptized a Catholic. He was given a Catholic burial. He requested Catholic last rites when he was dying and received them. He thought of himself as a Catholic, and this was not unusual for half Jewish or mixed marriage sons in the Parisian haute bourgeoisie. One of the great things about the French Revolution had been this ideal of universalism. And so the Jews were given full civil rights in France well before they were in other countries throughout Europe. But what that meant was that if you were Jewish in France, you kind of downplayed your Jewishness. You often converted to Catholicism because it was the kind of dominant social religion. And if you did practice Judaism at all, it was generally kind of discreetly and secretly. And a great friend of mine in France has just written this book called Les Mémoires Maudites. I don't know if it'll be translated here, but it's about kind of covert Jewishness in Proust's life and in his work. So my friend Patrick Mimouni, who's the author of the book, maintains that Proust probably and his family did observe at least some Shabbat dinners or some holy days, but they did it very, very discreetly. And Proust never actually even spoke about the Jewish side of his family until the Dreyfus affair happened. And even then it was to kind of distance himself from it. When some aristocrat that he knew who had been saying apparently anti-Semitic things, as most of the aristocracy did during the Dreyfus affair at a party, Proust wrote a letter to this man the next day and said, if I didn't comment on what you were saying last night or didn't chime in, I need you to know that it's because my mother is Jewish. And so it was this kind of strange, like he's both standing up for his family, for the Jewish side that he has also, but he's also shifting it a little onto his mother. So it's a really complicated and interesting question in Proust, and I'm now writing the second half of my book. Knopf agreed to let me do a second volume, and so that's one of the main things I'll really be looking at, because the Dreyfus Affair is such a powerful moment and such an influential moment for so many French Jews, including Proust. Finally, and then lastly, I already answered that question. What are your upcoming projects? Hard at work on this, more of the same, more of these people. They have many more decades of antics, secret love affairs, betrayals, rivalries, great art and not so great art that they collected and inspired. And yeah, that's that. So if you've got any other questions, otherwise I should maybe start signing books. Is that right? I don't want to make you all wait. Was there any quickly? No. Okay, then why don't we call it a night? I'll sit over here and sign books. Thank you for your attention.